county are you in? Got some Democrats on that county commission.
Absolutely. Well, I filed an appeal. I have a hearing coming up. Right?
Some legislatures, maybe in Texas, have capped the assessments. You can only go up 5% a year, something like that.
But yeah, we know that. Yeah, and every year, no matter what, it hits the maximum. Can you go back and you argue it?
Last year we because we were traveling, we couldn't walk in with the protest, and the attorney on the island before this, he filed a court, so we spent $1,000 or something on an attorney appeal, and got a whole lot of money back.
Oh, you did? It paid off for you.
So we went back to the attorney again this year and said, yeah, appeal it again. I haven't reached back to see how we did, but
some local communities they would shift the burden of the sales taxes, off property taxes.
We have that too.
So
We're
many-
about
so you want to appeal
That's about what I was saying.
in court, so people appeal it, that they gave you an automatic 10% rollback if people just complained. They didn't advertise it. So we looked at what happened. We said,
Wow.
So we told them,
So I gotta confess, given the number of emails I've gotten, as I mentioned last night, between COVID and the hurricane, wasn't sure if anybody would show up. So this makes me feel good. It actually is kind of wild. If y'all weren't here last night, I got an email from a guy who said I wanted to come and I can't come. My house is under a foot of water in South Carolina. Just the hurricane is taking people out, including, unfortunately, Glenn Youngkin last night and Speaker Johnson was going to come in, say hello, and then leave. And the Air Force apparently doesn't like to fly in the middle of hurricanes with the second in line to the presidency. But he did send a video, which we'll get to. A couple of housekeeping items for you. I want to say this out of the gate. This is the 11th of these that I have done. We started in 2009. And we've been going ever since with breaks for COVID and things like that. Next year, we're not going to do something like this. So as my radio show has grown now, I'm around the country from Sacramento to Miami to Hartford, Connecticut. And so many of you have flown in. There are people from 47 states and Canada in the room. And so we're going to start doing a road show next year, and we'll come to you so you don't have to come to me. And do smaller events, probably multiple ones, but also make it a little more. Like, for example, so I'm on in Tulsa now, and we've got multiple, we've got the governor, the state school superintendent, and a congressman from Oklahoma. So instead of them coming to me, I should be able to go to them. We can sit down with my affiliate in Tulsa and do something for listeners in Oklahoma. Or I'm in Miami and Orlando and Jacksonville, go to Florida. Instead of having Ron DeSantis come here, I'll go to Ron DeSantis. So next year will be a little different, but this year will be fun. A couple of housekeeping notes here. As I said last night, this is my favorite conference, not because it's mine, it's my favorite conference because everybody is so great and nice. It's not a rowdy crowd. I really have a no boo, no heckle policy at this conference because I don't agree with everything that everybody I have on stage says, but I think as someone who represents a portion of the right, we should be able to have broad conversations with a vast spectrum of the right, because everybody on the right now is figuring out what the hell do we actually believe, what are we going to fight for? I mean, we've even got tariffs coming back, which I thought were on the ash heap of history, and we've got people on the right now thinking maybe we should bring them back. So we should have those conversations respectfully. Whether it's the governor of Georgia, the governor of Florida, or Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, who I have disagreed with him many times and said so, and also this is the first time he's done an event outside of Kentucky since 2019. His first sit-down interview for something like this in a very long time, and yet he was willing to come here to sit with us and have a conversation with me, who's been a critic, and to talk about why the Senate still matters and why Republicans matter and why the country matters. And also, I personally think seeing him take all the arrows for refusing to fill Antonin Scalia's seat with Merrick Garland, he's deserved a round of applause by the right because of what has happened since then. I'm excited to have these conversations for the next couple of days. I'm delighted to have you guys with me here. My dad is here. If you see another Erick Erickson who looks like me in an older fashion, you'll know what I'll look like when I get into my 80s or thereafter, wearing his Rush Limbaugh tie. which he gave to me and then took back this morning because he knew I wasn't going to wear a tie on stage, which is fine, totally fine. I'll get it back in the will. Now, today is going to be, and I want to apologize in advance, a longer day than any of us probably anticipated, particularly after lunch. If you need to get up and leave to go to the restroom, don't worry about it. You're not going to offend us. I'd rather you get up and leave than heckle or boo somebody. But Senate Majority or Senate Republican Leader McConnell, they reached out 2 weeks ago and said if you can accommodate us, he can come. He hasn't done an event like this. He would actually really like to come. So we had to scrap this afternoon's break after lunch and rearrange the schedule to be able to fit him in because, I mean, if I can get him, I wanted to get him. So if you need to float in and out, that's fine. One thing I ask, please, for the love of God, all that is decent and holy in life, look at your cell phone, make sure it's in mute or turned off. Now, I will say last year, I did that. I feel, to this day, this is a year later, I feel bad. There was a lady right up front, and her phone started ringing, and I made an offhanded comment, and she didn't want to come back, and it turns out her son had just upgraded her to the new iPhone, and she didn't know there was a button on the side that you have to push in to mute it. She had no idea how to turn her phone off. And I felt horrible because she was so upset. So I'll try to be very nice on stage and not actually like shame people, but please turn your phone off or into mute, and I'll remind you again after lunch if I remember, because that just gets so annoying. We're now in like how many years since the invention of the telephone, and we still have them ringing throughout conferences. So that being said, the Speaker of the House wanted to be with us and could not be with us. And so I would like to, I haven't even seen the video from the Speaker of the House, and so Mike Johnson has sent us a video.
Hi, Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson here. I want to welcome you all to the gathering. Wish I could be there with you in person, but we're crisscrossing the country right now to try to raise the necessary resources to grow the House majority and help win back the Senate and the White House. We're bullish about November, and I believe we're going to actually be able to do that. As I'm traveling around the country right now, I'm talking with people in blue states and swing districts from coast to coast, north, south, east to west, and reminding them that right now we're no longer in a battle just between two parties. We're now in a battle between two competing visions for who we are as a nation and who we're going to be. As conservatives, we believe in the principles, the founding principles of America. It made us the greatest nation in the history of the world. It's not even close. The principles of individual freedom and limited government and the rule of law, peace through strength, fiscal responsibility, free markets, and human dignity. The things that made us the most free, most successful, most powerful, most benevolent nation in the history of the world are in question right now because the progressives are trying to take us over the ledge. We will stand firm, and I absolutely believe that together we are going to get another opportunity. That we'll emerge through this valley, get out of this valley, come to a much brighter place. So I want to thank Erick Erickson for all he's done over the years to stand for these causes, for all of you for your ongoing commitment. And I pray that we are successful, that indeed God will give us another chance to save this great republic. Thanks for being there. God bless you. We'll see you soon.
Now, I know how all this goes, and so I want to say thanks to a couple people up front before we get started. One is to Charlie, my producer, right hand, couldn't get anything done without him, who plans and organizes all this and runs interference for me. Also, Philip, who does digital for me, who's going to be putting stuff online. There's somebody else I want to recognize floating around. I don't know where he is yet because I can't see because there's a spotlight in my friend David Cannon. I want to highlight David, who, for free, last year and now this year has showed up to photograph the event. Now, I want to highlight him because I want to get him some business because I love his family too. If you've ever subscribed to Bass Pro or Cabela and you've seen the really beautiful pictures of fly fishing in like South Africa, that's David's picture. David flies all over the world for Cabela and Bass Pro. He does stuff for Coke and Home Depot and Big Green Egg. And so we've got his talent in the room this weekend taking pictures. And if you are a small business, David, I think in the last 100 days has been 5 in his own bed at home with his wonderful family. So if you want to send him some business, if you see the tall, goofy guy with the camera walking around, maybe with a pint of Haagen-Dazs in his hand, David's a great photographer. If you don't believe me, just go look at your local Bass Pro Shop and check out the fly fishing pictures. So thanks, Dave, for volunteering to come with his wife, Stephanie, to take pictures this weekend. And also to my assistant, Candace Gordon, who she and Charlie and Philip together keep me in line. She left her husband to be with us. I say that jokingly. Her husband sent her with him to a business conference in Dallas, Texas, day before yesterday, and we woke up to a text message at 7 a.m. saying, I've left Ramon, I'll be there at 11. So thank you to Candace for coming back to save us and keep us in line. Now, all that being said, let's start the day. If you haven't been here before, the conversation format is 30 minutes on stage. Many of you have submitted questions. I will weave those questions in. We actually have a guy here somewhere, he may not be in the room yet, from Halifax, Canada, who I even submitted questions for the American politicians. Thank you for your hatred of Justin Trudeau. I appreciate that greatly. So, let me introduce my first guest. You all know him. And let me just give you a little background from my vantage point. In 2018, I interviewed every candidate, Democrat and Republican, running for governor in the state of Georgia. And almost to a person, everyone came in with this massive entourage, except this one guy just kind of came in with a guy. Sat down, leaned back in the very cushy chair, and we had a great conversation, no pretension whatsoever. And the actual other person who came without a big entourage at the time was the governor of Georgia, Stacey Abrams. These two then wound up going head-to-head in the general election, and if you believe Hillary Clinton, my next guest didn't win, Stacey Abrams won, but of course, we know she went on to be the president of Earth in Star Trek. What we got instead was a guy who came in under the shadow of the then president of the United States, and a lot of people in the suburbs of Georgia thought, well, he's that guy's guy, he's not my guy. And he then defined himself as his own person. And what have we gotten in the state? Some of the most robust economic growth, the first state out of lockdowns from COVID, school choice, massive construction projects outside of Metro Atlanta. And if you ever listen to me on radio, living in Macon, Georgia, an hour and a half south of here, driving between there and the beach, often on I-16, the most desolate stretch of interstate outside of Montana. And if there are members of the legislature here, the speed limit should be no speed limit on that road, but that's another point. There are now, in rural Georgia, where there used to be nothing, there are massive construction projects because the governor of the state of Georgia decided, instead of being the governor of Atlanta and north of I-20, that there was actually this whole expanse of the state south of I-20 that also deserved good jobs for people so that they also weren't crowding into Atlanta and further destroying traffic. And it's worked. If you drive from here to Savannah, Georgia, go through Macon, head on I-16, you will see one of the most massive construction projects in the country. It is a massive Hyundai factory that's being built for their hybrid and electric vehicles. There are massive projects happening like that all over the state, in rural parts of the state, in parts of the state that used to not get the attention of the government in Atlanta. And all of that is because we have a governor who has a heart for Georgia, not just for Atlanta. He also has a deep passion for Georgia, the school with the football team, which is about my wife's only bone to pick with him because her dad went to Georgia Tech, but we can't all be basketball schools. So, without further ado, my friend, the governor of the state of Georgia, Brian Kemp. So let me get the awkward question out of the way first. This past Saturday, had a candidate for president come to Georgia, had some choice words for you, and then some of his supporters did a press conference and suggested you might need to be in jail. So, how's the campaign trail going?
Going good. You know, I was kidding with a small audience the other day, and I said, you know, we had this big storm come through the state this week, and then now we're dealing with Tropical Storm Debbie. So second storm we've dealt with, but you know what? We weathered both of them. We're doing great in the state. And I would just, look, a lot of noise out there, as you can imagine, a lot of distractions, which in my opinion is not what we need to be doing right now in the presidential campaign or on any of the campaigns that we're running in the state of Georgia to keep our majorities in the House and in the Senate. And so, despite all of that noise, my position has not changed. I've said a long time before, the presidential primary ever started, when we had all those great candidates that were running, that I was going to support the nominee, that we were going to use our political operation to win Georgia, despite past grievances, differences in a political opinion, maybe ideals, issues, whatever the case may be with any individual or the former president. Like, it is in all of our best interest that we win in Georgia in 2024, unlike we did in 2020. And we have the path to do that, like my campaign did, and the rest of the state ticket, whether it's Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General, Secretary of State, Agriculture Commissioner, School Superintendent, Public Service Commission candidates. We all won in 2022. We all had libertarians on the ballot. Nobody went to a runoff in state races because we ran on our record. And that's what we need to be doing now. In my opinion, regardless of all the different things that have happened, we cannot afford 4 more years of the Biden-Harris agenda and now the Harris-Walz agenda, which I think would be even more radical than the Biden-Harris agenda is. And so that's what we're doing. People talk about our political operation, our ground game that we put in place to tackle and really offset what Stacey Abrams did in 2018 that we didn't really know much about, that we saw work in 2020. And we just decided, look, we cannot rely on other people for our ground game in Georgia. So we raised an extra $50 million in the re-election campaign. We paid to do the door knocking, we paid to do the modeling, we paid to do the tracking, we paid to do the phone calls. We put our own people on the ground with a lot of great volunteers in the state and had a better operation than the Democrats did in 2022. So we learned what the playbook was. And we've got to do the same thing in 2024. So people that are talking about, the ground game and turning it over or working for the party, we're already doing that. We were doing that a month ago. I mean, we're knocking doors right now. We've already modeled people in our state house districts, and we're working on making sure that we turn base turnout out for people that traditionally vote early in our state, whether it's by mail or in-person early voting, that, will be here before you know it. And so that's what we're doing to support Republicans up and down the ticket in Georgia. And then also, I was with Senator Graham and Senator Daines and Senator Ernst with our great candidate in Montana, Tim Sheehy, I guess it was 2 nights ago. And we've done events for Sam Brown in Utah, Dave McCormick, Pennsylvania, Larry Hogan in Maryland, Pete Ricketson, Nebraska, trying to help get back control of the U.S. Senate. I had a great visit at the convention with Speaker Johnson, so we're committed to doing our part, either nationally or in the state, to hold our majorities. I don't think that's going to be an issue with our Republican incumbents in Georgia. But, my point is, we all need to be working hard to keep Georgia moving in the right direction. If we can do in 2024 what we did in 2020, it will end the narrative that Georgia is a purple state. It's a tough state here now. It's a lot different than it was when I first got into politics, when Sonny Perdue won the governor's race and we took control of the state Senate. But it's still a state we can win if we have, all the mechanics and things that you need to do in an election. We raise enough money, and then we have good candidates. And so, regardless of all the noise, we're plowing ahead.
So, you sure are hanging out with a lot of people running for the U.S. Senate. Any thoughts on your future?
Well, I'm hoping that maybe, we get big enough majorities in the U.S. Senate that I don't have a lot of pressure to have to do that.
Just figured I'd ask.
Yeah, well, I have a lot of people asking me about that. Look, I've told people that is a distraction. Y'all, that is a distraction. I know there's going to be a lot of great people here at the conference. There's a lot of great people out there that can do a lot of really good things in 2026 and perhaps 2028. but we need to keep our eye on the prize for 2024. I've said that for a long time. We all need to be laser focused. We can worry about who's running for what, you know, for the governor's office or any other constitutional office in Georgia in 26, taking our U.S. Senate seat back, which we absolutely need to do to have a conservative from Georgia in the United States Senate. It's not supposed to be the way it is right now. And I'm committed to doing that. And, you know, however that ends up working out, we'll see. But right now, we need to stay focused for the next, whatever it is, 89 days on winning the state, winning the U.S. Senate back, holding the House, and getting Donald Trump back in the White House.
So,
Yeah.
I can ask you this question unlike a lot of people because you served your first term, there was a Republican in the White House. Second term, now there's a Democrat in the White House. What is the collaborative difference between having someone of your party in the White House versus someone who's not?
Well, the thing that really bothers me about the Biden-Harris administration is, for the biggest thing, well, there's two really things that stick out to me. Number one, they're picking winners and losers in Washington, D.C. If you look at the IRA, I mean, we wrote a letter to our two U.S. senators before they voted on our IRA and said, look, this bill as written is going to pick winners and losers. It's going to help, you know, the big three automakers, the union-backed companies, and, you know, really pick winners and losers for the funding that was going to be out there post-IRA. You look back to when you had the Trump administration during COVID and they were passing COVID relief bills, everything was done per capita. So, you know, Georgia would get the same amount per person in a disaster relief bill that California would. You know, and the relief bills that passed under the Biden-Harris administration, if you had reopened during COVID and your unemployment rate was low, you would get less money per capita than a state like California that hadn't done that had higher unemployment rates. So they were rewarding people for staying closed longer versus just treating everybody across the country that was fair. So those inequities for the administration that's supposed to be for equity and inclusion, they were not. But the other thing is, and I think we talked about this, I guess it was last year when I broke my pencil out. We were talking, you know, I had to, you know, if you don't win, you don't get the pencil, you don't get to write the rules and regulations. And, you know, in this case, if we win the White House back and get conservatives back in office and charge all these executive branch agencies and, you know, commissions, whether it's the SEC, the FCC, you know, Federal Trade Commission, and other things, you get the pencil back. So you can start erasing the dumb rules that they've written. I mean, they are legislating by rulemaking in Washington, D.C. right now. And our thankfully conservative majority on the Supreme Court with the Chevron case undid a lot of that. But it's going to take years to undo really them pencil whipping us. So those are two things to me that really stand out. Regardless of, you know, I just was reading on the way over here, I know the Harris campaign has a new ad about how tough on the border she is. And how she's going to, you know, hire more border patrol agents and how, you know, she's going to support this tough border bill. And my thing is like, hey, just remember, you're in office right now. You can do that right now without being elected president if you could talk Biden into doing it. And I remind people, Republican governors have been complaining about the problem at the border for years. We have done press conferences. We've asked for meetings. We put out policy agendas of 10 or 12 things that we could do to secure the border. We know they will work because they were done, you know, by the previous administration. And you had the governors supporting the Trump administration by sending National Guard troops. And you didn't have the chaos that you saw early in the Biden administration. It finally got so bad they had to do something about it because they were getting killed politically on that issue. And, you know, I remind people, the Democrats had complete control of all three branches in the legislative process, the House, the Senate, and the White House from 2020 to 2022, when we were all complaining about the border. The Republican governors were, and they did nothing. And that's what people need to remember when they go to the ballot box in November.
Let me ask you about some state policy. You know, I'm actually in treatment as a recovering lawyer, And I've got a couple of steps to go in the recovery process. I've noticed over the last number of years up I-75, we're getting more and more trial lawyer billboards from lawyers in Florida who, as they've enacted tort reform, seem to be infesting the state of Georgia. What's your view on tort reform and what the legislature here might be able to do?
Well, we need it, no doubt about that. As a small business owner, both Marty and I, which we have the greatest first lady in the country, Marty Kemp. Both of us have been small business owners for over 30 years now, and I hear from small business people. I'm hearing from our Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 100, just rank and file people that are out there. We need to do tort reform. We had a lot of success last session working with the House and the Senate and got a couple of bills passed. We had a couple other things that, we got something done, but probably didn't get it done in the way we needed to. And then we passed a bill that was really part of our legislative package that's allowing us to work with our insurance commissioner, who I think General John King's in the audience. Great American, first Latino elected statewide official constitutional officer in our state, and
Thank you for not saying Latinx.
yeah, just retired from the National Guard, helped build a border wall, COVID response all over the country, just a great American. But we're working, our bill allowed us to work with John and his team and the insurance companies to get the data that we need, so we can really figure out like what the rifle shots that we need to do legislatively to stabilize costs or even bring costs down and help right the ship. I mean, we want the system to be fair for everybody, but right now it's really moving more toward the trial lawyer side, and it's killing people on the cost side and hurting our business environment. And I've told my trial lawyer friends that, a lot of them realize that, but that being said, it's going to be a tough fight. But I announced at the Georgia Chamber event 2 days ago that we're going to be holding some roundtables around the state, bringing in some of the people that have been adversely affected by the environment that we have, lost coverage and other things, and really to start making the case to the public and the legislators as to why we need to do more than we've done now. But make no mistake, it will be a tough fight. So if anybody out there is willing to be helpful in that fight, I would just make sure you're talking to your legislators, telling them real world stories about what's happening out there. I mean, I had a company that dropped some insurance coverage on some office warehouse space that we have. Thankfully, that's a good market, and there's other carriers that we can go to. But some industries are losing their carrier, and they have nowhere to go. And this has been an issue in Florida, in Texas, and other states around the country. And so we need to do something legislatively, and we're looking forward to working with the General Assembly to do that.
So, other policy issue, we've now, I think this past year, become one of 8 states to expand school choice. And I appreciate your leadership in actually publicly supporting, after a number of years in the state trying to get Republicans on board, and yet here we now at least have put our foot in the water.
Well, look, I am so proud and thankful of the General Assembly for what they did on school choice. The Education Secretary came down the other day and was criticizing what we did, and I'm like, I do not understand how you can criticize taking kids that are in failing schools and giving them an option to where they can get out of that failing school and get an education that they deserve in our state. I mean, to me, that is an absolute no-brainer. So we're in the process of implementing all of that right now. I'm very thankful to all the advocates that are out there that are going to help on the public awareness campaign to let people know what options are out there. We need to make sure that we implement this well and have great success with that. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. And hopefully the Education Secretary and the federal government can figure out how to fix the FAFSA form that they continue to delay to help people get financing for college educations, which has created a mess all over the country.
So we were going to have this guy here, real tall guy. I think you you've probably met him, but he had this hurricane come through his state and he had to cancel it. He actually wanted to come down and brag about how Virginia is like the greatest economic engine in the country. So I was kind of glad he wasn't here because it clearly is a lie, because I live in Georgia, know how much better you are than Glenn Youngkin. You may be shorter, but you actually generate a lot of economic power in the state.
You know, some people, when they lie, their nose gets long. I think Glenn gets taller. He's not actually lying, though. They did win CNBC's #1 state for business, and I texted him and congratulated him on that. We were in the top 5 again, which is great. You know, CNBC, some of their criteria, we don't like being #1 in some of their criteria. Actually look at it.
For those of you who don't know, like access to abortion and things like that have now become business.
Yeah, social issues weighing into the business equation, which to me, you know, it should be investments, jobs, you know, your business environment, but they kind of expanded that, but whatever. We're happy with our standing. We're still, for 10 years in a row, the best state in the country for business when you have the people that are actually making the site selection decisions. The consultants that are working with the companies, they still continue to, or have at least for the last 10 years, ranked Georgia #1. But you know, y'all, that's what's so great about the South. Governor Youngkin, Governor Ivey, Governor McMaster, Governor Lee, such competition, Governor Abbott. We are always competing with other states in the South, and we've done incredibly well. We've had 3 record years in a row. The good thing, I think, for somebody like myself that ran on strengthening rural Georgia, I think over half the jobs we've created, which I think is up to like 170,000 now in the last 5.5 years, or the private sector companies have created that they're bringing to Georgia. You know, over half of them are happening in areas of our state outside the 12 metro county regions. So literally dotting the whole map in Georgia, giving economic opportunity no matter somebody's zip code. Over 70% of the investment dollars, which is, you know, billions now, is going outside of the 12 metro regions. And these are just projects the state has worked. This is not talking about just the organic growth that's happening in Atlanta or Columbus or Macon or Savannah every day. So I will take what we've done the last 3 years and put that up against anybody in the country. And we probably talked about this last year, but for the first time a year and a half ago, GDP growth combined in the South, when you count really Texas all the way over to South Carolina, outpaced the Northeast for the first time ever in the history of the country. And it's because of the Republican governors. It's because of the business environment, and it's because, you know, the environment in the Northeast and in places like California. I mean, they're literally just running people out of their states. And we're glad to take them as long as they vote our way.
I've been out to North Georgia and seen that on 75 up towards Dalton, the project up there, but I've driven past that Hyundai plant outside of Savannah. That is a massive facility. One of the things that I guess I should ask, because a friend of mine's involved with that project, and like you've now got local governments. For those of you who don't understand, this thing is like 1.5 miles long construction project in a rural part of the state, where now you've got this local towns that may not have the local infrastructure to handle all the people who are going to be coming in, which is a good and bad thing.
Growth is definitely a challenge down there, which, you know, we're working with them on that. I mean, this facility is incredible, y'all, and this is the thing about IRA. The Hyundai plant, Rivian, the SK battery plant, all announced before IRA ever passed. So, you know, the Biden-Harris administration, Marty got so mad a while back because they were running an ad like taking credit for all those jobs coming. The SK battery plant up in Commerce, Georgia, if you ever seen it when you've driven up 85 North, Governor Deal announced that in the transition. I was with him, and then we announced the expansion in 2019. Joe Biden was not even in office when that happened. So, like, for them to take credit for this.
Doesn't know.
Yeah, no, they forgot. So, you know, these things were coming anyway, and so like the way they incentivize and then pick winners and losers, it's just bad public policy. But regardless of that, the Hyundai plant, we have gotten, I think, 12 or 14 suppliers for that plant too, places like Dublin, Statesboro, Metter, Effingham County. So you're going to see really a transformation in these communities. But we're also putting hundreds of millions of dollars into infrastructure on roads. We put $1.6 billion additional dollars into our freight and logistics plan last year with the support of the General Assembly. I'm very thankful to them for that. It's going to help us address transportation needs in that corridor. Probably $600 million of that will be ended up designated to the freight plan in that corridor. We put another $250 million into a low-interest revolving loan fund over at GIFA that many of you remember that Hunter Hill, who ran for governor as a state senator, is working for the state now, and I appointed him to the GIFA director, and he's working on these low-interest loans that local communities can get to build out their water and sewer infrastructure. And then we're also doing a lot of that through the incentive packages for the companies. And so, and then we have spent over $50 million too with grants that will go to local communities to help with workforce housing, because it's our belief and the General Assembly's belief that, you know, if you're living, you should be able to afford to live where you're working in our communities across the state. So like, even though we have challenges, we have a lot of solutions that we've been working with the locals on. So I'm really excited about the future. And this could be transformational. I mean, people now that are graduating with a, say, an engineering degree from Georgia Southern University, they're not having to move to Atlanta if they don't want to. You know, they can stay home, they can move to Savannah, you know, they can stay where they grew up. That is the values of our state, and it's what makes Georgia the best state to live, work, and raise your family.
Before we wind down, I should ask you, we did have Debbie roll through. How much storm damage did we as a state sustain for that?
Yeah, a lot. We're actually headed to the airport right after this, and we're going to fly to the Savannah airport and get on helicopters with Lieutenant Governor and Speaker, Agriculture Commissioner Tyler Harper, and a lot of the legislators will be on the ground. We're going to fly and see a lot of the flood damage. It was mainly a water event after the first evening when the storm came up from Florida, kind of came through the Valdosta area. Was a good bit of power out at one time, around 50 or 60,000, I think it was. They got that back on relatively quick after the first wave of the storm went through. After that, the winds kind of died down where they were a lot more tolerable, but the rain kept circling back around. And we got lucky. There was two tracks. One track was going to take the storm out off the coast of Savannah, regain strength, and it was going to, you know, boomerang back around and hit Savannah again a day or two later. The second model had it going on up the coastline, which it did, and it really pounded South Carolina and North Carolina with rain. But we had places like Statesboro, Scriven County, and others that had over a foot of rainfall in a very short amount of time, which created dams busting, which created homes below those dams getting washed away, being underwater. And so there's significant damage to, we had roads washed out. We're still inspecting bridges. So even though, and it was so crazy about these storms, like people in Atlanta or in Athens, we didn't get a drop of rain. You wouldn't even hardly know we even had a storm come through. But for people that were down there, you know, big flooding event was just a mess. We have, I was texting with Congressman Austin Scott, him and Commissioner Harper, and our team are already working on the ag situation with blown over cotton, peanuts floating up out of the field, some damage to our, you know, pecan trees and other things. And so we're just now getting to where we can get out there and start assessing all of that. But we're going to go give a briefing today when we get on the ground, get a briefing. But I am so proud of our response. We did an early state of emergency, which allowed us to put resources closer to the storm. We deployed the National Guard, so we were able to respond very quickly, helping clear roads where we could get power crews in, making sure we had high water rescues. We probably did 40 swift water rescues, people that, you know, may have had roads flooded out, they couldn't get from their home, that had lost power and they're running out of water and food to the mainland. And so we were floating people in boats. National Guard had high water vehicles, but just a great response from a lot of hardworking Georgians and a lot of other people that were helping us down there.
So last question before you get out of here. football season
Go Dogs.
coming up.
Feeling good? Yeah, I'm feeling good. You know, we got our I read this morning our center is injured, which creates a little bit of issues since we lost Cedric Van Pran to the NFL. He's a great guy and a great football player, but they're just being very cautious. So, you know, this season is such a tough schedule. We got Clemson in Atlanta on, you know, so-called neutral field, even though it's in the state of Georgia. It's going to be a really tough game. We got Alabama there. We got Ole Miss there. We got Texas there. And then we also, as usual, you know, have Florida, Auburn. And so we have, you know, really 6 teams that potentially have a shot at making the playoffs at the end of the year. So it's going to be a grueling schedule. We got to get lucky and stay healthy. But we have the players to beat anybody. And, you know, I think there's such a fine line. If you look back at the SEC championship game when we lost to Alabama, we didn't play our greatest game. They played their best. And we just had some people hurt and not 100%. And that really hurt us in that game. So we gotta keep people healthy, and we're going to have a lot of young players step up and get after it. But it's going to be an incredible year. Of course, it's going to be one of those years, if you're a traveling Georgia football fan, you're going to be broke at the end of the season.
Well, you know, having never actually been to Athens for a game, I may hit you up
You need
for,
to come.
yeah. I apparently I need that life experience, so I'll do that. Governor Kemp, as always, thank you for attending.
Thank you. Appreciate all that.
So my next guest, I actually wanted to ask him some questions about something that, well, a judge has told him he's not allowed to talk about. So I'll avoid. So, you know, there's this, well, we got the Antifa people in town, and my next guest happens to be the Attorney General of the state of Georgia, who's engaged in dealing with the Antifa people, but a judge has said nobody can talk about the case right now. So I want to, before he comes on stage, so he can't be blamed by anyone saying I'm bringing it up, before he gets here, I just want you all to know, I wanted to ask about this, and I know some of you submitted questions about it, but there's a gag order from a judge, so we can't talk about that issue. However, what we can talk about with Chris Carr, Georgia's Attorney General, is he's one of the Attorneys General who has spent a lot of time suing the Biden-Harris administration to stop their interference with states between environmental regulations and issues with immigration, with crime, you name it. There's been so much. An Attorney General for a state typically deals with so much of the interests and affairs of a state, and yet dealing with the Biden-Harris administration for so many states has become a full-time job as they try to force states, which under the Constitution are these semi-sovereign entities, to actually just be a Walmart subsidiary of a federal government, as opposed to their own autonomous, unique entity. So I do want to spend a lot of time talking with him because he really has led the fights for a number of states. Look, and I realize I got to say this lovingly for my friends in Kansas City and elsewhere. Your Attorney General running for election, been spinning out a lot of press releases, taking a lot of credit for a lot of lawsuits, but the guy who initiated a ton of those lawsuits that every other Attorney General is taking credit for happens to be Georgia's Attorney General, my friend Chris Carr. What's it like to be a pain in the ass for the Biden administration?
It's great, but Eric, first of all, you know, I'm a heavy metal guy, and I always tell the greatest first lady in America and the best governor in America, I need to be opening up for you. I should be the Motley Crue to your Metallica. Okay? That's how I feel like it should be.
Look, Charlie, from here on out, when he shows up, Inner Sandman will
please. I want it to be my walk-up music. That'd be great. Eric, literally the activists in the Biden and Harris administration wake up every day and give us something to sue them on. I mean, let me give you a list. Just a quick list. Title IX, we won. Student loan bailout, we won. Waters of the U.S., we won. SEC climate disclosure rule, where literally they want companies to give weather maps to show how they've impacted the climate. We won. Prayer school public meetings, Second Amendment, immigration, catch and release, remain in Mexico, unionizing farm workers and mandated wage increases, Georgia's Election Integrity Act. Let's not forget, the Biden-Harris administration is still suing Georgia over SB 202 from 2022 after we've had 2 statewide elections, local elections, and it was a cut and paste from Stacey Abrams' failed lawsuit and all of her campaign ads. They still are suing us over that. And then we've got energy independent issues and the Clean Power Plant rule, which is to, they want to do away with coal-fired power plants and natural gas, which again, Governor Kemp just talked about economic development. You have to have some of these things. The reason we're successful is because we have low cost, low energy sources. But the Biden administration, again, they wake up every day to do this. And why? And Eric, I spent time in Washington. If Congress isn't going to get things done, nature abhors a vacuum. That vacuum gets filled by the federal executive through regulation and executive order. So again, Congress doesn't push back. Who in our federal system can do it? It's the states. And as the chief legal officers for our states, we're in the best position to work with our governors and to work with others to push back. But think about it. Again, it's like Governor Kemp talking about the pencil. Remember, Leon Panetta said, strike the pen or we could law the land or whatever that may be. Well, that's what they're doing. And when you've got higher grocery prices for every time we go to the grocery store, you've got gangs that are recruiting kids that are younger and younger in our schools and across the country. You've got a border that is not secure, so we're seeing fentanyl human trafficking gangs come across the border. What is the Biden administration and the Harris administration focusing on? Making sure that biological males can compete in women's sports. That's what happens when they get to do this.
So it's not just that. You mentioned energy. I didn't even get a chance with Governor Kemp to talk about nuclear energy. You've got the environmentalists using the Biden-Harris administration coming into our states, as you mentioned, and just it's wrecking economic policy. So how do you, as an attorney general and the other attorneys general in the country, balance out your role as a law enforcement officer, a legal representative for the state, with also working with the other entities that are affected, whether it's the private sector or the public sector?
Well, I think it's my obligation to defend the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution, the laws of the state of Georgia, and represent the interests of the people of our state. Those are the individuals and the citizens of our state, but also businesses that are doing it the right way. That's part of it. And again, we don't see business as the enemy in the state of Georgia. One of the ways that we've seen, if you can't get something passed in your legislature, you can't get something passed by Congress, go weaponize your state AG. And oftentimes, somebody told me at the first bipartisan AG conference I went to, the power you have, and remember, anybody who uses the word power, they abuse that word, okay? The power you have, you can call a press conference and drop a company stock 20%. Well, why in the world would I do that? But you have to be able to balance that out. And yes, it's our job to look at the laws of our state. But like I just said, as Congress, and I got to commend the Speaker. I think Mike Johnson's done a great job getting some things passed. And Leader McConnell's got a challenge because we got to get the Senate to get some things done. But if Congress isn't going to do it, the administration is going to continue to pass these executive orders and regulations. And who runs the executive branch? It's usually political appointees. So it becomes a political process. They're gonna always overreach because they're trying to get a political bump from this. And the student loan thing is a great example. They know they can't do that. We've beaten them twice. But it's one of the most brazen political moves I have ever seen. So you have to be able to balance that. And I think from my perspective, I'm glad I spent the time 10 years in Washington with Senator Isaacson. All of these issues I just mentioned, for the most part, we dealt with while we were there. I'm glad I was at economic development because I see the impact of laws on our state. And again, we don't see business as the enemy. We see the transformative nature of the free enterprise system. And then now as AG and really expanding kind of from the criminal, you have to be able to balance that and to be able to work with AGs around the country. Look, my Republican AG colleagues and I say we're the last line of defense against the Biden-Harris administration and liberal policies. And we take that very seriously. It's a point of pride.
So I can ask you this. We will no doubt with you a little bit on this. How does the dynamic after Looper Bright change your ability to take on Washington? After Looper Bright goes for Chevron.
Well, so to me, again, at the federal level, we've been pushing this for a long time. And again, I never understood why the courts would defer to the executive branch on what is a fundamentally judicial role, which is interpretation. So I don't think at the end of the day, I think we're going to actually see probably some more lawsuits, but it's been aligned in a way that I think makes more sense for the judicial branch to provide its interpretation and not just rely on the executive. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see. Some folks think it's going to end lawsuits or it's going to reshift it. And I think what it's going to be is it's going to put the judiciary in the proper role of interpreting what are the words on that page. Not what's a bureaucrat in the executive branch, on Pennsylvania Avenue or Constitution Avenue says, but what was the intent of Congress, which is supposed to be the first among equals.
So let's shift it, because when a lot of people think Attorney General, they think crime. And you entered into a situation where we had a mayor in Atlanta for a while who basically threw the police under the bus, had a massive spike in crime in the city. A new mayor who came into Atlanta and told the police, do your job, crime starts going down. But in that void, there was a time where the governor was having to bring in more state police into the metro Atlanta area to quell crime. But you yourself in your office had to step up to play a larger role in not a civil lawsuit role, but a criminal enforcement role. Can you talk about how you as a state officer can fill the void when there's failure at the local level?
Absolutely. And Eric, I think you got to go back to 2020 to understand, which, as you mentioned, was during the term of the previous mayor, but also 2020 is when a lot of liberal DAs got elected, okay? And the new criminal justice reform post-2020, a little bit before, but certainly then, on the left, was don't enforce the laws that I don't like. Well, that is a violation of oath of office. It's a dereliction of duty to have one executive or judicial branch member say, I don't like the law, so I'm not going to enforce it, undermines the American system that we have. It completely ignores the rule of law. But that's what we saw. We saw it in San Francisco. We saw it in LA. We saw it in St. Louis and Baltimore. We've seen it here in Georgia, in Athens, in Atlanta, and around the state. So that was the new criminal justice reform. But I will say, going back to the Constitution of the state of Georgia, Article 1, Section 1, Paragraph 2 says the paramount duty of government is the protection of person and property. So that means I don't care where your race, gender, sexual orientation, where you live or where you're from, you deserve to be safe. But what was happening is a lot of these folks are saying, I'm not going to do it. And if you don't like the law, that's fine. But run for the legislature, run for Congress. That's how we change laws. So instead, in Georgia, we did it differently. And again, because of the governor and the legislature, thank heaven for having a governor that cares about protecting all people and a legislature that does as well. 2017, we added domestic terrorism, which you mentioned coming in. 2019, human trafficking, 22 gangs, and 24, we now have organized retail crime because all Georgians deserve to be safe. And if DAs aren't going to do their job, then the state needs to come in. If you look at those issues, they're all kind of multi-jurisdictional. They're where the gangs don't care what the city or county line are, human trafficking, that type of thing. But think about this, Eric. Who are the communities most often terrorized by gangs and violent crime? Lower income, racially diverse, immigrant populations. Who are the communities that are most often impacted and vulnerable to human trafficking? Lower income, racially diverse, immigrant populations. You talk to the governor about school choice. Who are the communities that are most often negatively impacted when you don't have an opportunity at an education? Lower income, racially diverse, and immigrant populations. My friends, it is us, conservatives and Republicans, that are the cavalry. We're the ones that are coming and bringing the ideas. We're the ones that are protecting people no matter where you live or where you are in this state. And we're the ones that are providing opportunities. We should be proud of that. We need to be screaming that from the rooftop because that's the success that Governor Kemp was talking about. And that's what we're going to continue to do.
Steer yourself where you need to go, because I know there are some legal rulings as to things you can and cannot talk about, and I'll avoid the one specifically I know, but you mentioned the organized retail crime. If I can step out of your role as Attorney General and just look around the country, I've kind of been shocked at the initial immediate media dismissiveness of the idea that there was some organized, non-organic wave of retail theft that was happening. We've seen it here in the state and around the country. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it does not appear to me to be as organic as the media would have you believe it is.
No, and so let's go back. When I started talking about human trafficking, folks were saying, nope, you're making this up. This is a boogeyman. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. And we've proven it, and we now have a unit. Last year, we rescued and assisted 129 victims. And give First Lady Marty Kemp a lot of credit. What she did with the Grace Commission is bring everybody together so we can talk about it and rescue those kids. We start talking about gangs. Governor Kemp was running on it back in 2018. I run on it. Folks on the left, the media said, you are making this up. Well, we come out with a survey that says, it was done by the Georgia Gang Investigators. Asked all 159 counties, do you see evidence of gang activity? 157 said yes. Know what that tells me? 2 counties lied. Nobody wants a gang in their backyard, but they can see when there is, and they want to know that the cavalry's coming, that there's a plan, and we're doing something about it, and that's what we're doing. And now it's the same with organized retail crime. Now you see people saying, well, this is just simple shoplifting here or there. But when you have cities that are saying, we are not going to arrest you if you steal up to $900, what do you think is going to happen? So every single day, you saw somebody going into a CVS or a Walmart or a Home Depot, whatever it may be. What we know is organized groups are going and hitting brick and mortar retail and selling that online. It used to be you go to the pawn shop. Now you go online. So I had a great retailer in Georgia show me how they had a group of people hit every store coming down 75, going over the top end perimeter, up 85 into South Carolina. We've got a company that produces commercial pallets for Amazon and Walmart and others. Found hundreds of thousands of dollars of pallets in the deserts of New Mexico. Anybody's a golf fan, I'm reading Golf Digest the other day, people going into pro golf to PGA Superstore, grabbing drivers and putters and putting them online, genuine parts, you name it. And again, when the CVS or the Walgreens or the racetrack or QT, whoever leaves a community, which communities are most often impacted? Lower income, racially diverse, and immigrant populations. So I think if we're going to be the #1 state in the nation to visit, which I'm so proud of, and again, we continue to do all the things that need to be done to do that, part of that is also protecting companies that are doing it the right way, their employees and their customers. Because when you see those videos online of somebody running into the Home Depot, usually it's an employee that's getting knocked over or a customer. And we got to do something about it, which goes back to the original question that you asked me, how do you balance it? Yep, we got to take care of our people and our businesses.
So, this is, again, I don't coordinate these conversations beforehand. Everybody kind of flies blind, as do I, coming in to see where the conversation goes. There have been a couple of instances in the state now where companies have punished employees over shoplifting. What's your thoughts on that, and is there anything that the state can or should do in that situation?
Well, that bothered me at the beginning. And then I got talking to the companies. What was happening is, again, employees were getting hurt. Employees are hired to be associates. They're hired to sell something. They're not hired to be deputies. And so I now understand, no, we should not put employees in harm's way. But Eric, what I would also encourage our businesses and our corporate folks to think about this. Don't fire somebody for trying to stop a criminal. That's the other side of the coin. People were getting fired for trying for taking pride in their business. So what I think we need to do is, again, we are putting the resources in this organized retail crime unit. We're organizing and coordinating with federal, state, and local law enforcement. We're going to raise awareness on this, but I do think it's incumbent on law enforcement to handle this issue and keep companies and employees and customers safe. And I'll say this, whether it's gangs or human trafficking, now organized retail crime, we're kind of on the front edge as a state, and I'm really proud of that. Some states have, human trafficking units, not a lot of them. Some have gang units, not a lot of them. Organized retail crime is one that we're on the cutting edge. I'm proud of that for the state.
You mentioned the 2 counties without gang issues. When I was on city council down in Macon before I got there, our former mayor had disbanded the gang task force. And because there was no gang task force making gang arrests, he could say there was no gang problem in the county because the gang task force was not arresting anyone. It's interesting how you skew that data. But then that leads me to human trafficking, which was the issue why I ran for office, and there was a tie-in to gangs. And when you mentioned people saying it's not really happening, there is this view out there that people on the right overplay as a moral panic, human trafficking. Yet Congressman Roy, who will be here tomorrow, I heard he was doing a live interview, I think last year on TV, when the Border Patrol pulled over a vehicle that had people like in the trunk who were human trafficking victims. It is happening, and it seems like there's this corridor along I-20 from Texas through the southeast where this is an organized issue that isn't an abstract. You mentioned the data, that this seems to be international, not just local.
It is, and so part of why Georgia is the #1 state in the nation to do business is our logistics network. Ports, airports, roads in particular. We are 2 days by rail and truck and 2 hours by plane to 80% of the U.S. market. That's why we're as successful as we've been. But criminals can also use that network, like you just mentioned, whether it's coming across I-20, whatever it may be. So again, we don't stop investing in logistics, we stop the criminal activity. And in part, that's training. And you start looking at law enforcement training on from the police department level, sheriff's department, you name it. The Grace Commission has done a lot on that. I think that it's critical that we do that. There's two different types of human trafficking. There's domestic minor sex trafficking. There's sex trafficking. We focus on domestic minor sex trafficking, adults buying kids for sex. And then there's labor. And the governor has put money into the GBI to focus on labor trafficking as well. We focused on it too, but there's no doubt. And folks used to say, wasn't Atlanta the #1 place for human trafficking? Well, nobody knows the numbers because our numbers have been higher because we started prosecuting it earlier. So it's kind of the opposite of the Macon situation. Oh, and by the way, I see my friends from Athens who are here. We were told when we came into Athens there was no gang problem. No gang problem. We've indicted 21 individuals because there's a gang war going on in Athens. And we're not leaving Athens until there's a district attorney that agrees to prosecute those cases because the people, I'll take that round of applause back there. Absolutely. But it's also why we have to coordinate with our law enforcement partners nationally at the federal, state, and local level. And there is, like I said, there's something going on in Georgia. As I go around the country, people say, how do you get federal, state, and local law enforcement to work together? Well, we've done it differently. I've got a Georgia anti-gang network that we put together first time ever, 2017, get federal, state, and local law enforcement talking. Because it's amazing what happens when human beings will actually talk with one another. You can solve some problems.
Amazing. So let me
I'll take that round of applause.
Let me ask you about the Athens situation. We had the situation with a very progressive attorney there, and there was the death of Laken Riley, and there has been a lot of, I guess, federal state squabbling over the situation, and also how that local community can navigate with a district attorney that doesn't just represent Clark County, but Oconee County as well, where the people are way more interested, it seems, in having a law and order DA. How do you, as a statewide elected official, balance those interests, and can you talk, or any update that you know of on the Laken Riley prosecution?
My interest is on keeping people safe. My interest would be on Laken Riley and her family. And Eric, let's be clear. The Biden-Harris administration, the federal government failed Laken Riley and her family. Law enforcement in New York failed Laken Riley and her family. And the sanctuary city policies of Athens, Clark County failed Laken Riley as well. Those progressive members of that commission that were on there in 2019 that were cheering being a sanctuary city can pretend that they're not one anymore all they want. They know they are. The policies that they adopted were along those lines, and they were cheering it on. That being said, we can handle gang cases, so I would have been proud for our office to make sure that justice was done for Laken Riley. The DA in Athens, though, did turn the case over to the Prosecuting Attorney's Council of Georgia. They have a great gang investigator that has the case, and I am confident that Laken and her family are going to get justice.
You mentioned the Prosecuting Attorneys Council, you know, we've got the situation with the Fulton County suit involving the former president, which is on appeal, whether or not that'll be moved. And a lot of people say that Chris Carr, the Attorney General, gets to have this role that I think people don't realize you don't necessarily have the role of you get to say, hey, I'm going to send it to this guy or that guy. There is actually a council that does that. Poor old Mr. Scandalakis, I guess, is actually it has to deal with this. Can you talk a little bit about how that council works?
Yeah, so the Prosecuting Attorneys Council, great partners. They organize with the DAs and the solicitors, but they also have statewide authority to be able to handle some of the cases. When there is a conflict, years ago, our office was happy to handle the conflict cases because it was basically just administrative. And then I told you in 2020, you got a lot of criminal defense attorneys that were liberal that became prosecutors that took over DA's offices around the state. I think the first year we had the authority to handle these cases and find conflict counsel, we had like 26. And in 2021, it was up to like 475. And what happened is you had a lot of these new DAs that were giving us all these cases to conflict out of. But the only way it works is these DAs have to be willing to take somebody else's case in order to balance out the conflict. But it started becoming a political issue. So I went back to Pete and I said, Pete, look, we're happy to help, but we're not going to be a political prop for anybody. It really makes more sense because the Prosecuting Attorneys Council has statewide authority. So now we're one of the entities that can get cases. You can give it, the prosecuting attorneys can keep it, another DA could take it, or solicitor. If it's a solicitor, our office, if we have jurisdiction. But I'm very clear, I think putting us in the position of taking a case that we don't have the expertise in, bad for everybody. Or you could hire a private practitioner as well. But, you know, one of the things I should have said too, Eric, going back, talking about this and talking about the DAs that got elected, you know, Kamala Harris is the leader of the progressive DAs around the country. She goes back to San Francisco. She's the one that was friends with all of them in San Francisco and Los Angeles and Chicago and St. Louis. And again, I saw the governor laughing about the new ad about the border. But boy, you talk about somebody that was all about sanctuary cities and defunding the police and cashless bail. It's Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yeah, it is. Now, I got to ask you probably the most important question of the day. How's your wife? She's much better half than you.
She
smarter,
is,
better.
Absolutely. She is great. She's doing fantastic. She was chief of staff to 3 U.S. senators. Way cooler than me. She's doing great. She's going to be so glad to know you.
Yes, absolutely. So, okay, now, as we wind down here in the last few minutes we have, Attorney General in Georgia, if you could look to the future, with the legislature convening in January, what's your big issue that you think the legislature needs to consider that can help your office?
Well, I want to thank the governor and the legislature for giving us these resources to fight domestic terrorism, human trafficking, gangs and organized retail crime. They just gave us some more resources so that we, in the gang unit, we started off in Atlanta, Augusta, and Albany. July 1st, they gave us resources to now be in Columbus, Macon, and Southeast Georgia. I want to see where we can continue to grow. Human trafficking needs some more resources. I'm excited about this organized retail crime. But I'll go back to one of the things that the governor said, and it goes back to my economic development days, that's tort reform. Something needs to be done. It needs to be addressed. There's no doubt that costs are going up. I mean, you're a recovering attorney, and I'm an attorney. You know, the way we handle disputes, we the people set up the judicial branch. So you have to have access to the courts, and I wouldn't deny that at all. But what we now have is we have, you know, a bastardization of the system. We have people that are taking advantage of the system. The governor talked about increased insurance rates, and John King does an unbelievable job fighting for the people of Georgia. We've got increased costs for premises liability. You were talking about advertising. I took my daughter to Disney last year, so it was a year ago May. We're coming up 75. And for those of y'all who are Georgia fans, there was a tragic situation with a lineman named Devin Willock that was killed in a car accident. Here I am coming up at 75 last year, and there's a plaintiff's firm that's got Devin Willock's picture on it, and he died 2 years before. We've got an issue that we've got to deal with advertising as well. I've been fighting third-party litigation funding. These are groups that are literally, you know, it's dark money. We don't know who's putting money into these groups so that we can find out, so that they can fund litigation. I think we got to focus on that. So common sense solution, it is an economic development issue. We got to focus on that as well, I think.
Okay, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this because you mentioned it so many times and I haven't really probed on it. Can you talk about the gangs? What sort of gangs are you seeing? Because, I mean, in my mind, from the way I grew up, we were talking Crips and Bloods, but you got MS-13, you've got other Central American gangs that are way more violent than anything we've seen domestically. What sort of gangs are we?
Again, they're all over the state, all races, genders. It's all about making money. It's all about selling guns, drugs, human beings. I tell everybody that the most violent gang that we had, and actually our U.S. attorney, Bobby Christine, was in the Southern District. He had a big bust at the end, but the most violent gang that we've seen in a while.
50s?
Yep. It was the Ghost-Faced Gangsters, which was a white supremacist gang that started in the Cobb County Jail. So it's everybody that's working together, and we just had a big bust in Augusta too, where again, you can see, I can't get into all the details, but you had a lot of different groups that were working together. But one of the things that we did, we know that we see fentanyl coming across the border. We know we're seeing gangs come across the border. We seized 15 pounds of fentanyl. That's enough to kill 3.5 million people. So think about this. One operation in one city, in one state, in one nation. Enough fentanyl to kill 1/3 of the population of our state. Think about that. This is why we have to secure the border. This is why we have to stand up for law enforcement members that we're asking every day to go into harm's way. This is why we got to continue to work together, and why I'm proud of our state to focus on business issues, to be focusing on keeping everybody safe no matter where they live, and I thank the governor and legislature for doing it.
The Attorney General of the state of Georgia. So we can't actually do this conference without some great sponsors and organizations. And one of my concerns, and look, I don't want to pick fights with people, but like, for example, tariffs are a terrible idea that we used to learn. Like, if we're going to apply to an enemy, maybe, but to like replace the income tax with a tariff, we know how much they would generate, and it would actually cause inflation. And there are fights out there on the right that I think it's good to have the conversations, but also we know the ideas, and there are lots of great groups on the right who have kind of stood up and said we need to like rethink these things. We need to have a voice. We need to actually be engaged on the right in conversations about good public policy and where we can head in order to engage. And so we had a lot of great groups, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm making sure that I'm on track, because normally I have a paper schedule and I forgot to grab one. And I want to make sure that, yes, we do have a break after Patrick. But we couldn't do this without these groups, and in addition to doing this without these groups, we couldn't have the conversations that we as people on the right need to have without having these groups here. So it's not just great to be able to partner with them to be able to lower your costs, to be able to have a great conference. It's great to have these groups sit on stage, have conversations, discuss the ideas on the right, where we talk about the ash heap of history, where we have through tried and true methods put bad ideas away and embrace good ideas. One of my favorite quotes is from G.K. Chesterton about the democracy of the dead, that we do things today because the people who came before us, they tried and failed and tried and failed and then tried and succeeded, and this was the idea they did. And so we should be humble enough to give the dead a say in what we do, because they tried and failed and tried and failed, and the way we ordered a society was through those bad ideas failing and the good ideas rising. And why should we go back and retry the ideas that always failed? Why should we go back to a world where we have weird taxes in this country that actually disadvantage the middle class and the poor? Why should we go back to doing things that Republicans long ago said, this isn't a way to order a society? And also, why should we go back in a way to reorder society in ways that the left wants and embrace ideas from the left? And so I think it's time to have those conversations. And I'm excited to bring up on stage a great sponsor. We couldn't have made this conference work without the Taxpayer Protection Alliance and Patrick Hedger. Look at this. See, now as I'm sitting and talking, everybody rushes and gives me schedules. Like, I don't want to kill my battery, and needed to also make sure that I get you out on time. So Patrick, first, tell us about the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce myself and introduce the organization. My name is Patrick Hedger. I'm the Executive Director of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan taxpayer consumer watchdog organization that's been around for a little over a decade, and we've been fighting for lower taxes, less government, and more accountable government. A little bit about myself. I'm sure like a lot of you, I looked at the incredible schedule this morning and said, wow, that's a lot of great names, and who the heck is this guy? And I've been in this movement my entire career. And I got into this movement because I'm the son of a small business manufacturer. My family's company was a multi-generation company founded here in the United States, and we made manufactured equipment, soup to nuts manufacturing in the United States. The kind of jobs and the kind of business that any of the politicians that have come up on this stage or will come up on this stage would love to tour and say, wow, look at this. We're glad this is in this country. We're glad that this is happening in my district or my state. And politicians say stuff like that, but then policies destroy businesses like that. My father, when he was president of that company, was never worried about his leading competitors. He was always worried about the 3 and 4 letter agencies out there, IRS, OSHA, EPA, and whatever new creative rule they were going to come next to extract rents out of him. And I got into this line of work because we had to be thankful as a company, as a family, that my grandfather died in 2010 and not 2011. We had to be thankful that cancer saved our American manufacturing business from the IRS. Because in 2010, the Bush tax cuts phased the estate tax, the death tax down to 0. And then all of that came roaring back in 2011. And so I don't think anybody should have to ever be in that position. All the way down to the lowest employee at that company should not have to lose their job because the owner dies. And whether it's the estate tax or whether it is a new oppressive type of regulation, we shouldn't be killing American innovation, manufacturing, and jobs for policies that don't adequately address the cost-benefit analysis, don't adequately weigh trade-offs. Like Thomas Sowell famously said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And so our mission is to fight back against policies like that. It's an expansive mission, Taxpayers Protection Alliance. We work on anything under the economic sun. But I think your introduction was right on. There's a lot of things that are coming back these days that we thought were on the ash heap of history. And we're increasingly fighting folks on the right who are bringing back policies that we thought we beat Democrats on long ago.
Yeah, okay, so I'm in my head steering this, and I want to get there, but through this, because if I can mention your name without people booing because we're friends even as we disagree, David French, New York Times, interviewed Neil Gorsuch. And Gorsuch and French together made the point, complexity is a subsidy for the big, and it's a penalty for the small. And when you look at our regulations, when you look at our tax code, as everything becomes more complex, like I've got this idea that the American entrepreneur can be a David and slay Goliath and himself become Goliath and then himself be killed by the next David. But now our Goliaths are surrounded by the tax code and regulation, the IRS and the 3-letter agencies who arrest David for even thinking that he can take on Goliath. And that complexity seems to be like the #1 subsidy for preventing the creative destruction of the marketplace from taking place.
Oh, 100%. We call them regulatory moats. And there's a reason why you increasingly see some of the biggest and largest companies in the United States are building new headquarters all around Washington, D.C. Because they understand that the greatest potential benefit to their business and the greatest existential threats to their business exist in Washington. They're not competing on Main Street, they're competing on K Street. And the tax code is so complicated that if you call the IRS, the IRS is the taxpayer advocate has found that IRS agents, frankly, they give like wrong information a lot when you call the IRS and ask, what am I supposed to be doing to comply with my taxes? So even the IRS doesn't understand the tax code. And then the Code of Federal Regulations, love to give a shout out to, I'm an alumnus of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Every year they do a measurement of the Code of Federal Regulations. We're talking a federal regulatory code that is in excess of, I think it's 200,000 pages now. And the total aggregate regulatory cost on the economy is larger than the GDP of India, the most populous country on the planet. And that's the burden that the federal government puts on American businesses. But to your point, it is those businesses that have the ability to hire the lawyers, hire the lobbyists, and hire the accountants to deal with those things. And it's the small businesses that can never get through that regulatory morass that end up suffering. And so for all the talk that you hear from politicians and regulators about preserving competition and helping the little guy versus the big guy, the minute you pass a 2,000-page bill that supposedly enhances competition, all you've done is empower the people that are able to influence those bills, write those bills, and comply with those bills.
You know, related to that, I had to hire an accountant as I've gotten into syndicated radio and it started growing. And he looked at things, and wildly, I was paying myself a salary. And he said, you know, actually, if you cut your salary in half and then you do an owner withdrawal disbursement, you're actually going to save your company money and you're going to save yourself money on taxes. And I thought it's stupid that I, as a business owner who pays salaries, have to hire an accountant to tell me not to pay myself a salary because actually it'll save me on taxes. And like, what? Why the hell does the system even work? That's like small business owners aren't hiring themselves like strategic tax advisors, and yet they almost have to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the federal government, it's amazing. The left hand often doesn't know what the right hand is even doing. I mean, even within agencies, you have regulations and regulatory programs that completely work against one another. Great example is within the Environmental Protection Agency. On one hand, you have a mandate that for more ethanol in your gas tank, which reduces your gas mileage. And on the other hand, the EPA is working with the Department of Transportation to force you to increase your gas mileage. We've got programs that completely work against one another, all within this, again, enormous thicket of regulations. And that is, I'm surprised the U.S. economy grows at all. I mean, that is a testament to the genius of the American entrepreneur that we're even growing at close to 2%. Because of just the enormous regulatory cost and the kind of confusing, head-scratching things like your example that business owners are dealing with on a daily basis.
So let's get from the complexity then into ideas that are resurfacing on our side. Why do you think that is? I guess my concern, more accurately phrased, is a lot of the ideas that are surfacing on the right are ideas that in the 50s and 60s were advocated by big labor Democrats, and now suddenly we're having these people on the right to bring up the same ideas.
Yeah, I ascribe it to just, I would say, maybe political policy laziness. One of my favorite quotes is from the children's book, The Phantom Tollbooth. It says, the only thing you can do easily is be wrong, and that's hardly worth the effort. And I think there's a lot of that going on in politics and policy right now, where it's much easier to tell people what you think they want to hear versus what they need to hear. And it's very easy to take a lot of populist talking points that are generally progressive policies, cover them in more stars and stripes in America, and call that conservative. And there's a lot of that happening right now on the right. I've been in, like I said, I've been in this field my entire career. And I've gone from exclusively fighting progressives to arguing with conservatives as well over really a lot of the same policies. Nowhere is that more evident in the resurgence and interest in antitrust policy, which I think is really upstream of all of the other problems that we can expect from the progressive left. You talk about things like ESG policy, you talk about things like DEI, whatever, corporations doing things that you would never expect corporations to do or be interested in. Why are they doing those things? And it's because they see the threat from the federal government. They see a threat from an empowered progressive government that is going to pick winners and losers, like the governor said. They control that pencil. But the problem is right now, we've got a lot of folks on the right that are sharpening that pencil for the left.
Okay, I'm glad you said that, because what I hear from longtime friends of mine is, well, the left is doing this, we're never actually going to stop it, so we might as well do it as well. And my concern to them is that historically, every time we've seen the right embrace what the left is doing, they then build new precedents that, because there's no such thing as permanence in American politics, eventually the left takes back, and now we've set all these massive precedents they then go with gusto to use against us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's effectively, I say this a lot, there's a lot of folks on the right now that think we can use the levers of government to affect our own conservative ends, whether those be social goals or cultural goals or economic goals, by using the bully pulpit, using the sledgehammer of government. And the only way that logically works is if you expect to never lose an election ever again. And I got news for folks. I don't know if you've looked at the recent polling. That's not a guarantee this November anymore. And so the idea that we're going to have a second Trump administration like the first one, where we were able to achieve a lot of the deregulation that was really successful and saw the economic growth that happened in the first part of the Trump administration, that's not a guarantee. And you're absolutely right. We are seeing Republicans, they're calling themselves Republicans, that are now going along with a lot of lawsuits and regulations that are being driven by the progressives, particularly after the technology sector, because nobody likes what the tech companies are doing. There's different reasons that both sides dislike the tech companies, but the tech companies right now are being used as a proving ground to try and unmoor antitrust policy from one of the greatest conservative victories of all time, which was anchoring antitrust policy to the consumer welfare state. So prior to Judge Robert Bork and the Chicago School in the later part of the 20th century, antitrust was sort of a whose line is it anyway type policy. You could use it to affect really any end you wanted. And to such an extent that a Supreme Court justice remarked in a dissent on an antitrust case, saying the only consistency I can find in antitrust law is that the government always wins. And that's what the progressives want. They can achieve through, because if you read the underlying antitrust statutes, the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, they're pretty vague. They're short and they're vague. They grant a lot of power to government, and it was only after decades of fighting back against those things that we were able to rein all of that back in. And there's nothing more that progressives would love than to be able to unmoor antitrust from that objective consumer welfare standard. And that way, if you are a business, a large enough business, and you are engaged in any sort of merger or acquisition activity, or even not, they can say, well, we'll come after you unless you do what we say. What's your corporate board look like? Is your workforce unionized? What are your carbon emissions looking like? These things are not theoretical, they are happening. What we are hearing right now from M&A attorneys is that they are getting questions from the FTC and the DOJ that they have never gotten before. And they're all related to these progressive policy priorities. And the scary thing is there's a lot of people on the right in Washington these days that are cheering that on.
Yeah, and I want to dive deeper into that, but before we do, I think we should probably explain for people so we don't get too over everyone's head that essentially in antitrust, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, that if the business is lowering prices, that we look at this from a consumer standpoint, that if a monopoly, for example, is not screwing the consumers by bilking them out of all their money, that it's okay. A monopoly is not bad, an abusive monopoly is bad.
Correct. There are things like economies of scale, right? It's good to have a big airline that goes to lots of different places. It's good to have a big cell phone company that covers you all over the country. It's good to have an internet network that connects you to most of the internet, right? But what we just saw last week, the federal government won a significant portion of its case against Google. But Google hasn't raised its prices. It's a free service to most people. Advertising prices have come down. They are beginning to chip away at that consumer welfare standard. They got a victory against Google simply for being big. And that's really concerning because it's not going to stop there, right? You can have your problems with the tech companies, plenty of people do, and there's a lot of good reasons for it, but that is going to bleed over the borders of Silicon Valley into the rest of the economy, and the progressives haven't been shy about it. I mean, Senator Amy Klobuchar often says the economy is way too concentrated. It's all the way from cat food to caskets. I don't know why she chose those two examples, but but that just shows
She was thinking of her staff.
Right. that shows you the breadth that the vision that they have to be able to micromanage the economy. Forget ESG, forget DEI via regulation. They're going to do it via antitrust.
Okay, so in that regard, this is one of those moments where I had the thought and then the thought leaves my head. It's that age, almost 50. No, so you do have, in the antitrust scale, you mentioned Google, but the other one is what struck me, JetBlue and Spirit Airlines, trying to do that merger. They worked on it for about a year and a half, it seems, got all the way to the end, and they said they didn't have gate access in airports. Because of the economies of scale, JetBlue needed to grow. They couldn't get efficiency with the fuel prices, seating, things like that. And suddenly the federal government says, no, we don't think you should do this. The Biden administration doesn't like the merger. Then next week, both airlines have to start laying people off and cutting routes.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this. We're seeing a lot of industries abandon mergers and acquisitions which inject a lot of investment into the economy, by the way. But that in that particular example, yeah, very problematic because Spirit is on its last legs right now. And so the Biden administration's objective was to say, well, we can't really have the top 6 airlines going down to the top 5. They're going to do that anyway because Spirit may not be here with us next year. And then you leave just a weaker JetBlue to be able to compete with the bigger airlines. So there's a problem with where this administration, and again, some on the right are going, where there's an expectation of that quantity of competition is superior, but I think quality of competition is better. I'd rather have an airline that's offering a better service to more places and be able to compete with the other big airlines than having 2 weak airlines that really can't compete whatsoever.
Spirit goes out of business, that'll really make the Spirit Halloween branding really easy for the corporate headquarters. Not that we want them to go out of business. So now let's move more into the right here, because these policy ideas that are resurfacing, back to what we were talking about earlier, that we can wield power. I get this a lot from my listeners on my radio show, that they feel like when I say this, I'm saying we're disarming, and I'm trying to explain to them, we're not disarming ourselves, we're disarming Washington. So the left can't hurt us any more than we can hurt the left. And I do understand there's this political idea that they've been coming after us, we need to go after them. And my view is that the way we go after them is we take away their power to come after us.
Yeah, that's what conservatives used to be for. But now we're seeing a bunch of policies emanating from the right, exactly as you said, like, why don't we use this power to affect our own ends? But again, you're not always going to be in power. And regardless of whether it's a conservative or a progressive that's changing tax policy or regulatory policy back and forth, that uncertainty begins to cause problems in the economy. The constant regulatory ping pong between, okay, my tax rate's 10% now it's 15, now it's 20, now it's back to 15. That kind of stuff is way worse than just having stable, predictable tax and regulatory policy. So that's the big risk by trying to do what the left is doing, but with slightly different branding.
So let me play devil's advocate here, because I get this when I bring up this topic. A lot of people saying, well, we are not actually on the right ever shrinking government. And I guess my point is, look at the deregulatory record that we have, which is good, but how do you address that point of people on the right who feel like we always say we want to cut the size and scope of federal government, we never do?
Yeah, that's a fair criticism. I've been very frustrated. I mean, I started my career and I was very worried about our $12 trillion debt, and that just seems cute now. And so Republicans need to understand that, yes, when we get power, we've actually got to do these things. We got a taste of it actually at the beginning of the Trump administration. The 2 in, 1 out deregulatory policy, the massive tax cuts that happened, those were good things. And it shows that you can affect conservative victories, but it's a commitment issue. And I worry that we're really losing that commitment now, because it's just a lot easier to say, well, we're going to just do what the Democrats have done over all these years, but with conservative branding on it. And that ratcheting effect is going to be incredibly problematic. And we're already seeing that the consumers are left in the lurch. There's a lot of these different policies that get proposed, particularly in the tech sector right now, where you've got Republicans and Democrats mad at tech companies for different reasons, right? Republicans are upset that the tech companies are suppressing information. Democrats think that they're allowing too much information. And what you have right now is an attack on both fronts on American tech companies, and all that's doing is empowering Chinese tech companies. And so we are at a real risk here of throwing the baby out with the bathwater as we continue to have these fights over how we're going to best use government to affect our own ends, instead of allowing entrepreneurs and innovators to make those decisions.
What should we be thinking of if, for some reason, we are able to win in November the White House, the Senate, the House? I mean, if you could talk to them, what's the first thing you think they need to have at the forefront of their mind?
They need to have at the forefront of their mind they've got 4 years at a minimum, 8 years at a maximum, and that they're not going to be in power forever. And that the precedents, right, this is a country that is unique in its success because we have a British common law system. And precedent has an enormous bearing on what happens in the future. And so when you begin to undo really good conservative precedents in the name of trying to achieve conservative ends, you're going to create huge gaps for progressives to be able to drive a truck through. And you're also going to create problems where you are creating problems for consumers that may be completely opposite of what you're trying to do. I mean, nowhere is this more prominent than when you're attacking the tech sector. I keep talking about that because that is where the antitrust proving ground is right now, where we keep having these conversations about tech. Well, how are we going to protect our kids, but we want to blow open these tech companies? Well, those two things don't align, because if you're talking about protecting kids, we've got a bill that passed, a law now that says TikTok has to divest. Okay? There's a national security issue there, there's a parental issue there, folks have concerns with TikTok, Congress acted, but the mechanism by which it acts is to say that the app stores run by Apple and Google can no longer list TikTok if they don't divest. Yet at the very same time, we have lawsuits at the Department of Justice and legislation floating around in the states and in the federal government that would force smartphones to be more open, and therefore it would make it easier for kids to go around those app stores and just download TikTok straight from the open web. And so again, it gets back to the regulation, the pile of regulation that we're seeing, and the fact that conservatives are now beginning to add to that shows that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and we've got these policies that are achieving completely opposite ends.
We probably ought to meditate on this point just a moment so everybody understands, because I'm in the camp that TikTok is a national security issue given what we know. So it's good that we're trying to force them to have a sale. But at the same time, the way the legislation would work, as you pointed out, is that Apple and Google would have to take TikTok out of their stores if they don't divest. But at the same time, the federal government wants to make it so that Apple and Google have to allow people to download standalone apps outside of their store so that TikTok could still be on people's phones, even as they're not allowed in the stores for Apple and Google. It actually does not make any sense.
And that's exactly what's happening, because there is a large push to, and this kind of gets back to our original point, to say, well, I'm doing something about this, versus thinking about the long-term consequences of those actions. And that, I think, is the big problem that we have right now. There's this sense that, and I think it's fair to say, well, when Republicans have had power, what have we done? And that's a fair criticism, but that's not an excuse to then get power and do things that are backwards, and do things that are going to cause more harm than good. Put cybersecurity at risk, put kids at risk. I mean, a big bill that's being debated in Washington right now, the Kids Online Safety Act. I think there's a lot of constitutional problems with that bill, but if you're talking about wanting to keep kids safe online, why are you talking about also, in the same breath, and a lot of the same legislators as well, talking about making a lot of the security features that are built into phones illegal because you're worried about competition concerns? We've got to prioritize one or another here. Like Thomas Sowell said, I love coming back to that quote, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And I don't think we're really adequately weighing trade-offs in Washington anymore.
Not only are we not weighing trade-offs, but it also seems like we have a lot of people in Congress who have no idea how the hell any of this stuff works, trying to legislate. I'm reminded of, what was it, the late Ted Stevens and his explanation of the internet was a series of tubes carrying information. It really does seem like Congress is out of their wheelhouse, and so they're relying on third-party groups who have vested interests in shaping legislation in ways that are good, not necessarily for consumers or the middle class, but for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting that, this recent antitrust case against Google, the administration and some of its allies on the right are saying this is a huge victory for consumers, but the biggest beneficiary of the antitrust case against $2 trillion Google is $3 trillion Microsoft. I mean, that's not fighting for the little guys. You're talking about business decisions and business disagreements that are not being litigated in the market, they're being litigated in courtrooms, and they're being litigated in the halls of Congress.
Well, let me jump in here, because I've talked about this on the radio, because I've got mixed feelings on it, because I do have concerns with Google, but it seems like because one of the things the court found is that Google is paying Apple billions of dollars to be the default search engine, that the way this will work as a resolution is that Apple will no longer get billions of dollars from Google, but Google will still be everybody's default search engine because Google has become the verb to search the internet. So Google actually wins and saves money through the lawsuit that determined that Google violated antitrust.
Yeah, we'll see what the remedies end up being. I mean, there are some folks that want to see vast breakups of these companies and want to bar these companies, whether it's Google or Microsoft or Apple, any of the big companies that make up a good amount of everyone's 401k, prohibit them from really effectively competing again in the future, making new mergers and acquisitions. And I think that's really concerning. That's a potential remedy to say, oh, and we've seen that in legislation as well, saying, well, we're not going to let these companies grow any larger than they are now, ignoring the fact that the investments those companies make are what attracts new companies into the market in the first place. We've made it very hard for companies to go public, and so a lot of investors, and particularly in Silicon Valley, say, well, your business proposition is, I'm going to invest in you and I need to get paid back. And there's only three ways I get paid back. You get huge and successful on your own, unlikely. You go public, which is even harder because of federal regulation. The size of companies that are going public these days continues to grow, which means you don't have small businesses becoming publicly traded at a very high rate anymore. You already have mega corporations that are the ones going public. Or you get acquired by a larger corporation. And if you take away those paths to investor exit, you're not going to have investor entry. And I worry about the stultifying and the ossification of the American tech sector and the American innovation sector broadly, not unlike what we see in the European Union. What's happening right now in Washington in terms of regulation of the tech sector, regulation of competition policy broadly, is a direct copy of the playbook that the European Union has put in place. And I challenge anyone in this room, name a large European tech company. I can name a bunch of large Chinese tech companies, right? Tencent, TikTok, ByteDance. The largest European tech company barely registers in the Forbes, for the Fortune 100. There's one. And this is an economic bloc that is twice the population of the United States, and prior to the financial crisis had a larger GDP than the United States. And it doesn't produce cutting-edge companies. And the regulators here in the United States are saying, wow, what they're doing over there, we'd like that over here.
You mentioned that. Well, first, to end the punchline on the Google antitrust, it is somewhat funny that the winner of the Google antitrust, besides potentially Google, is Microsoft, the last company sued for antitrust, which is kind of wild. But then in the EU, it's funny, they're passing all these regulations, and every company they intend to regulate happens to be an American tech company. None of there aren't enough over there to qualify. Maybe Spotify, I guess, but and the Biden administration isn't standing up for the American tech companies in Europe.
In fact, we found that your tax dollars have been paying for U.S. regulators to go over to the European Union, go over to Brussels, and actually cooperate and help the European Union craft these types of regulations that are targeting and extracting from American tech companies. Say what you want about the American tech companies, they've made a lot of political decisions that I can't defend, but at the same time, that's trillions and trillions of dollars of value and millions of jobs in the U.S. economy that is being openly attacked by our allies in the European Union, and the Biden administration is using your tax dollars to help.
So let me get into a question from the crowd that came up, and it wasn't particularly directed at you, but we mentioned Google and these tech companies. There is a view, one I increasingly share, that a number of these companies are pretty openly hostile to conservatives. And so I understand the impulse of conservatives saying we've got to fight back and maybe we have to use the government to fight back against these companies. What is your recommended solution for those of us who do have this concern that a lot of these companies aren't just progressive companies, they're progressive companies helping to advance progressivism?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a difficult one. And these are the difficult questions that I see a lot of folks on the right these days are avoiding. It's just easier to say, well, liberals want to break them up too, so we're just going to do that. And we're going to undo all of the antitrust victories that we've had as conservatives because we got to do something about these companies. Not thinking down the road that, well, oil and gas is next, or that major retailers are next, you name it. I think it requires looking deeper at the type of incentives that are coming out of Washington right now. Forget looking at FTC and DOJ for solutions. Look at what's happening at the Securities and Exchange Commission. We actually have a project at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance Foundation, SEC Mission Creep. The SEC is increasingly becoming sort of a social regulator because you have activist investors in this country that are able, because of SEC rules, to get items on corporate shareholder ballots at a very easy rate, to the extent that Bernie Sanders was able to speak at Walmart's shareholder meeting. I mean, that shouldn't be able to happen easily, but it's happening because the SEC has lowered the threshold for activist progressive groups to be able to force companies to weigh in on these issues. And these companies don't want to do it, but if their shareholders are forcing them to, that's a big problem. And I think we ought to look at that. We ought to look at why is the SEC tipping the scales to make it easier for progressives to force companies to be getting involved in social issues where they otherwise wouldn't. You start there, and then when I look at things like antitrust, that's a break glass solution, right? We're not there yet. We haven't even tried the fire extinguisher.
So you mentioned that. I do an ad for the bank that I use. It's called Old Glory Bank. It's an online bank. Instead of trying to start a bank from scratch, they purchased a bank in Oklahoma. They did rebranding. They expanded the platform, and it was set up by a bunch of conservatives who have been concerned about banks that are seeing progressives buy the shares, become activists, pressure the banks to close the accounts of gun stores, gun manufacturers, conservative activists. And this company, as they're trying to grow and get investors, actually avoided being publicly traded and looked for investors who could invest in a different way to avoid progressives being able to come in and buy the shares. And it struck me as they went through this process that here's a model American bank by conservatives for conservatives concerned about this situation that had to go out of its way with lawyers to find a way to get investors because it knew if it decided to be publicly traded, you could have a bunch of progressives buy the shares and then, because of the SEC, force them out of their mission.
Right. So I think we could solve a lot of these problems without opening up and loading a bazooka for progressives to do whatever they want when they're in power by simply paring back and keeping these types of objective standards of regulation that we fought hard for and expanding those. I think we need to have objective standards of regulation of shareholder issues at the SEC. We don't have that right now. Progressive groups submit these issues into the SEC. It goes into a black box. We don't know who at SEC decides what corporations have to vote on. But I can guarantee you it's a long-time progressive bureaucrat that's worked in Washington for decades. And it's being influenced by the progressive administration. So we've got to open that up, have more transparency in those types of issues of what publicly traded companies have to be working on. Because I can tell you, a lot of them don't want to be dealing with these issues, but they feel that they have to appease a government that is increasingly weaponizing itself.
It's funny you say that. I know a couple of CEOs, and this conversation comes up with the progressive issues that they take on. And one of the things they mention is you don't understand, we all now have chief diversity officers. And if I scale this back, I get labeled a racist and fired. That person leaves and goes into academia. And the SEC constantly comes up in shareholder fights that people don't understand this. And you mentioned earlier, and a CEO for a major corporation told me this, that the danger that we have on our side is that we are setting precedents the left is not just going to use against oil and gas companies, but gun manufacturers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really the core thing here is that the hangover of I'm sure it'll feel great if you achieve the antitrust or regulatory victory for conservative ends against a major corporation that you dislike. But the hangover of that is it's going to be turned around and used against you tenfold. Because progressives are a lot better at wielding the weapons of government than we are. And again, we're not always going to be in power. It's an inconvenient truth. I think it's really important to get back to that kind of core issue of where is this stuff emanating from? Because the purpose of a business and a corporation, right, is to deliver value to their shareholders. So that is where you've got to begin to look at solutions. Because otherwise, again, we're at a real risk here throwing the baby out with the bathwater and, again, ossifying the dynamic investment in tech sector and innovation sector and other corporations that we're seeing. I think that's a huge problem, and it's something that, again, it feels like the easy solution. It's an easy solution over a political horizon, right? The average elected official is only thinking over the next 2 to 6 to 8 years. But these decisions that we're making now are going to have lasting consequences for decades. And so it's about making sure to have that foresight and say, let's not go get the quick, easy win. Let's treat the lasting core issue here, and hopefully that will pay dividends for decades.
So before we wrap up, let's get back into the Taxpayer Protection Alliance specifically. If people want to get involved or find out more with what you guys do, where should they go?
Yeah, so our website is protectingtaxpayers.org. You can find us on Twitter, X, whatever they're calling it these days, at Protect Taxpayers.
The Supreme Court 9-0 ruled it's called Twitter.
I did see that.
Yes.
I did see that. So it's an important precedent.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the easiest way to find us. Go online, find us at www.protectingtaxpayers.org. We talked a lot about the issues that I see in the regulatory state right now, but we work on lots of different issues. We work on IRS accountability. We work on sports stadium spending accountability. Is something that I've weighed in on recently, where a lot of
for you.
public tax dollars going to billionaires doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I thought we were fiscal conservatives. But so we work on any sort of issue under the economic sun, trying to keep government limited and accountable, and make sure that whether it's progressives or Republicans and conservatives, that we're not creating weapons in government that can be used against the taxpayer and the consumer.
Well, and let's end on that point then, because I just, and again, this isn't to be a broken record, and I don't want to bore the crowd, but because it comes up so much, and it is my biggest fear with where we're headed, I can see it coming. You saw it when the Obama administration set a bunch of precedents, and I was writing at the time that what the Democrats don't understand is they're setting precedents that if Donald Trump got elected, he would use, and he did. And then had to say again to the Republicans, you're setting precedents the Democrats are going to use because there is no permanence in politics. Unless we're suddenly going to abandon our constitutional system, which we're not going to do, that I do think conservatives really have to think about. I want to throw the punch, but when we've thrown the punch, we can't they're going to punch back, and the only way to stop them from punching back is to essentially take away their arms. And the way you take away their arms is you take away Washington's power to throw a punch.
Yeah, absolutely. That reminds me of an old saying, right? We got to get back to this country where there's no fun saying, like California makes technology, Texas makes energy, Iowa makes food, Washington makes it hard. And we've got to get back to focusing on how is Washington making it hard? How do we strip those things back? How do we decentralize power? How do we give power back to the states where it's easier to achieve political victories? If you're able to disperse and decentralize that power, these problems become a lot less severe. Because when Washington weighs in on something, it has obviously national ramifications, and it carries a much bigger weight. You impact interstate commerce versus let's keep the bad policies for the most part isolated to places where people are voting for those things, and not have effectively California regulators running the country, which they're basically doing in Washington right now.
So let's where we at. You're a family small business. You mentioned the Code of Federal Regulations. You're not the first person to say this, and we probably should end meditating on this point that the cost of federal regulation prevents an economic explosion in this country, because the governmental compliance and cost to governmental compliance is money that companies can't then reinvest in their company to grow jobs and build things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a dead weight loss, right? Every dollar that you spend on a lawyer, every dollar that you spend on an accountant is a dollar that you can't spend hiring a new machinist, hiring a new delivery driver, buying a new Ford truck to make your deliveries, what have you. I mean, that's all money that goes to Washington and pays for high-priced bureaucrats, and that's money that's not being spent. It's money spent filling out paperwork. That's not creating value. Right? We got to get back to focusing on how do entrepreneurs, businesses, whether it's the largest tech companies in the country or it's a small business like my family's small business, how do we get them refocused on creating value for consumers and more interested in competing for dollars versus competing for your votes? I think that's really important. We got to have that differentiation between competing in Washington and competing on Main Street. And right now, because of the complexity and because conservatives are abandoning free markets, which I'm very concerned about, you're going to see companies competing for political favor, and that's not healthy. That's not sustainable. That's where we end up with negative economic growth, and that's going to have huge ramifications long term. I mean, the only way we're going to get out of the fiscal crisis that we're in right now is growing our way out. Cut spending, sure, but we've got to grow our way out of it too. And you can't keep layering on regulations, right? We've got a problem right now of we've got to fly, and there's a lot of folks, particularly on the left, but certainly on the right, that want to swallow a spider instead of just going after the fly.
I got to confess to you, When I looked at the schedule, when somebody handed me one, I was like, oh, 45 minutes. Oh, 45 minutes. And now we've sat here for just about 45 minutes, and I actually have so much more that I can talk to you about. This is right in my wheelhouse, and it's so much of what I've been talking about with my audience on radio that we've got to not just wildly throw punches. We've got to be thoughtful and strategic in how we move, because I really am afraid about the precedents we set. So thanks for sitting here with me for as long as you have to talk about this stuff. And I hope it really does get conservatives to think that we don't want to like set the precedents that they then use against us, because time and time again we wind up being Wile E. Coyote shoving the rock off the cliff only to have it land on Wile E. Coyote.
Absolutely. If you want to continue this conversation with me or my staff that's here, we've got a booth out there in the hallway. We'll be talking about our app security project, where we're talking about the various cybersecurity trade-offs and issues that are being created by some of the things we talked about right now. We'd love to have that conversation with you. So we'll be here all weekend. And thank you all so much for listening, and thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Chris calling out there. I said, you show up everywhere.
So, this is where you get a 15-minute break. And then we have the governor of Florida, the former vice president of the United States, and then you get lunch. So, we'll take a quick time out here. I'll go right to the restroom. I'll come back. And we've got a great lineup this afternoon. So, we'll be right back.
We'll be back.